History records many coups, but few executed with such quiet perfection. When Sima Yi moved against Cao Shuang, no battle was fought, no fortresses burned, and no imperial troops clashed in the streets of Luoyang. The empire simply adjusted itself around the new reality, like a bureaucratic organism obeying its own reflexes. Cao Shuang thought he governed the state of Wei. Sima Yi knew better. He knew the empire had already fossilized into habit and hierarchy, and that the real throne sat not beneath the emperor, but inside the files, stamps, and procedures of the capital. By the time Emperor Cao Rui died, the Wei dynasty had aged far beyond its years. It had been born out of war, hardened by conquest, and built around men who fought, not those who filed. But after decades of uneasy peace, the bureaucracy that once served the generals had grown into a force of its own. What had begun as a military state was now a system of clerks and protocols. Every order, every appointment, every requisition required a seal and an endorsement. The vitality of the founding generation, men like Cao Cao and Xiao Huyuan, had given way to a culture of formality. The warlords were gone, the accountants remained. Sima Yi had lived that transition firsthand. He had begun his career under Cao Cao as a strategist whose words could move armies. He had seen how quick decisions and battlefield charisma once defined survival. But over the years, he watched that style die out. The new empire no longer rewarded decisiveness, it rewarded obedience to precedent. By the time Cao Shuang emerged as regent, the empire ran on inertia. Officials feared novelty more than incompetence. They obeyed procedure because it protected them. In such a system, legitimacy wasn't measured in loyalty or might, but in paperwork. Whoever held the imperial seal, the Empress Dowager's edict, and the palace gates didn't need to win hearts, they only needed to exist within the rules. The bureaucracy would do the rest. Sima Yi recognized this shift better than anyone alive, and he realized something else. Cao Shuang did not.
When Emperor Cao Rui died, he left his young son Cao Fang under the guardianship of two men. Cao Shuang, his cousin, was energetic, confident, and ambitious, a man who enjoyed being seen as the new power of the realm. Sima Yi, decades older, was the opposite. Careful, disciplined, and visibly exhausted after a lifetime of campaigns. The pairing looked balanced, but it was inherently unstable. Cao Shuang represented the new aristocracy born from privilege. Sima Yi embodied the old discipline of survival through competence. One thought power was inherited, the other knew it was managed. Cao Shuang quickly maneuvered to dominate the regency. He filled appointments with his clique, He Yang, Deng Yang, Ding Mi, and Bi Gui, and shifted the Empress Dowager Gul to a distant palace to neutralize her influence. He treated Sima Yi as a relic, allowing him nominal honors but no role in real governance. At court, the talk was of his brilliance and modernity. In private, it was of arrogance. His circle indulged in xuanshui, philosophical debate about metaphysics and purity, while neglecting administration. They debated the nature of being, while the grain accounts went missing. Sima Yi watched it all in silence. Every memorial crossed his desk before being sidelined. Every complaint from provincial officials eventually found its way to his private archives. It wasn't outrage that motivated him, it was analysis. He was collecting data on how far decay had set in. He saw that the state no longer feared external threats as much as internal embarrassment. The same bureaucracy that had once followed orders from warlords now waited for permission slips. In that kind of empire, a coup didn't need to frighten people, it only needed to look official. The story of Sima Yi's feigned illness is often told as a clever trick. In reality, it was an experiment. When he suddenly withdrew from court, claiming sickness, Cao Shuang sent Li Sheng to check on him. Sima Yi staged a performance worthy of theater, lying in bed, hair uncombed, unable to lift a spoon. When kanji spilled down his chest, the messenger left convinced that the old general was barely clinging to life. To Sima Yi, this was an intelligence test. If Cao Shuang believed the act, it would confirm what the older man had already suspected, that his rival measured threats by appearances. And so it proved. Cao Shuang relaxed completely, gloating to his associates that the old tiger had lost its teeth. He even reduced the surveillance around Sima Yi's residence, confident that his rival was finished. That moment told Sima Yi everything. He learned that Cao Shuang was governed by assumption, not verification. He learned that his younger man's circle was smug and talkative. Any rumor of Sima Yi's real health would take days to reach the regent. Most importantly, he learned that Cao Shuang feared risk. A man content with rumor is a man afraid of confrontation. Cao Shuang's regency became an echo chamber of aristocratic comfort. He led an expedition against Shu, not because it was necessary, but because it promised glory. The campaign ended in failure. His logistics collapsed, and he returned with nothing but self-justification. He built new palaces, hosted banquets, and expanded the ranks of his favorites. Ministers began to mutter that the state served his household rather than the throne. The bureaucratic class, meanwhile, despised his clique. They saw in him not reform, but indulgence. He Yan's empty philosophizing, Dang Yang's opportunism, Ding Ni's cruelty each deepened the resentment of scholars and administrators who valued restraint. Sima Yi listened. Every insult whispered in the corridors of Luoyang was a future ally waiting for an edict. The regent had isolated himself socially and politically. He was surrounded by loyal flatterers, but had no institutional allies left. Sima Yi did not need to persuade anyone to support him. He only needed to offer the illusion of moral correction. Once he could claim to act for the emperor, the discontented bureaucracy would fall in line automatically.
When Emperor Cao Feng announced a ceremonial visit to his father's tomb at Gaoping, Sima Yi saw the perfect convergence of weakness and timing. Cao Shuang personally escorted the emperor out of the city, taking his brothers and much of his guard with him. The capital was suddenly hollow, its gates, armories, and ministries left in the hands of complacent administrators. That night, Sima Yi moved. He went to the Empress Dowager and presented a memorial accusing Cao Shuang of corruption, negligence, and abuse of power. He framed his action not as rebellion, but as restoration, the removal of dangerous men to preserve the dynasty. The Empress Dowager, long resentful of her own exile to Yangning Palace, agreed. Her seal transformed conspiracy into law. With that edict in hand, Sima Yi ordered Luoyang's gates closed, the armories seized, and the bridges guarded. The capital obeyed without resistance. Not one garrison challenged the orders, not one clerk refused to sign. It was the most elegant coup in Chinese history. By the time the emperor's procession reached Gaoping, Sima Yi already was the government. Sima Yi's confidence was not arrogance. It was calculation. He had spent years observing how Wei functioned. He understood that the empire was held together not by conviction, but by habit. He had seen it in the ministries, officials who refused to make decisions without precedence, clerks who copied old documents rather than draft new ones. He had seen generals hesitate on the front lines until a written order arrived, even when the situation demanded improvisation. Wei, he realized, was no longer a living empire. It was an autopilot government. And in an autopilot system, the man who touches the control panel controls everything. Sima Yi's entire strategy flowed from that insight. He didn't plan to fight his way into power. He planned to occupy the command nodes, the Empress Dowager's signature, the city gates, the armories, the archives. Once he had those, the rest of the machine would function on its own. He also knew something deeper about human behavior inside that machine. Officials in a bureaucratic empire think first of self-preservation. When power shifts, they don't fight for loyalty, they adapt to continuity. So long as the change of leadership is framed as legal, they obey. Sima Yi's edict was legality itself. By invoking the Empress Dowager's authority, he made resistance indistinguishable from treason. The bureaucracy, relieved to have instructions, aligned itself instantly. But there was another layer, the psychological profile of Cao Shuang. Sima Yi's long career had trained him to read men like Cao Shuang. He had served under 3 generations of Caos, each defined by suspicion and ambition. He had watched promising generals undone, not by defeat, but by their inability to judge character. Sima Yi survived because he learned what destroyed them. He knew that power does not corrupt evenly. It weakens those who inherit it. Cao Shuang was born after the wars, surrounded by luxury, insulated by birth. His world was one of scholars and courtiers, not soldiers in scarcity. He had never faced existential danger, and therefore he mistook calm for control. Sima Yi had cataloged every sign of that weakness. When Cao Shuang's generals brought grim news from the front, he deflected blame rather than address it. When He Yan and Deng Yang's extravagance offended the officials, he defended them to maintain appearances. He feared disorder more than defeat. To Sima Yi, that revealed everything. The man was ruled by face and comfort. He would take the safest course available, even if it meant moral surrender. That was why Sima Yi risked so much. He knew Cao Shuang would not fight back. He would panic, consult his advisors, and seek negotiation. The logic of self-preservation would corner him into surrender long before swords were drawn. Cao Shuang's inability to act decisively had been demonstrated before. On his failed Shu campaign, when supplies ran short and officers urged retreat, he hesitated for days, unwilling to admit defeat. By the time he withdrew, morale was gone. That same paralysis would resurface at Gaoping. Sima Yi didn't need spies to tell him this. He had observed it through years of bureaucratic correspondence. A man's letters reveal his soul. Cao Shuang's memorials were verbose but indecisive, eloquent justifications rather than commands. They explained what should have been done instead of what must be done. To Sima Yi, that was proof. When confronted, Cao Shuang would explain, not act.
At Gaoping, when news arrived that Sima Yi had seized Luoyang, Cao Shuang froze. He set up temporary defenses near the Yi River, but the gesture was symbolic. His household was still inside the capital. His brothers and friends were hostages by default. His advisor Huan Fan proposed a desperate but brilliant plan: escort the emperor south to Suchong, issue a new edict declaring Sima Yi a traitor, and rallied the provincial armies. It was the only move that could flip the narrative. But Sima Yi had already calculated the emotional geometry of this moment. He knew that Cao Shuang would fear the optics of abducting the emperor. He would imagine how history would describe him, not as a savior, but as a usurper. And so it went. Cao Shuang hesitated. He opened negotiations. Sima Yi sent envoys promising safety. He swore by heaven that if Cao Shuang laid down his command, no harm would come to him or his family. The message was formal, dignified, and delivered by familiar faces. It sounded official because it was. Cao Shuang believed it. He said to his aides, "Sima only wants power. We can still live as marquises." He surrendered his seals. The capital welcomed him back with polite silence. A few days later, he and his family were executed. To historians, the episode demonstrates Sima Yi's cunning. To Sima Yi himself, it must have looked like confirmation of diagnosis. Every assumption he had made proved correct. The bureaucracy submitted, the elites applauded, and Cao Shuang obeyed the script written for him. The empire's inertia absorbed the shock. Officials who had served under Cao Shuang continued serving under Sima Yi without interruption. The laws remained, only the signatures changed. Sima Yi was confident from the start because he had stopped thinking in terms of rebellion. To him, the coup was not defiance, it was repair. The state had malfunctioned under incompetent operators, he merely restored the system to working order. And in a way, the empire agreed. After the executions, no protests erupted, no provinces rebelled. For an empire that once trembled under Cao Cao's armies, the silence was astonishing. Bureaucratic states do not weep, they simply update the registry. What made Sima Yi certain of success was not luck, nor divine favor, it was pattern recognition. He had watched 3 generations of rulers and hundreds of officials, and he knew exactly how fear, pride, and habit interacted inside the administrative mind. He knew that Cao Shuang's arrogance was not strength, but insecurity. He knew that the bureaucracy valued legality over loyalty. He knew that the Empress Dowager's resentment was ripe for manipulation, and he knew that a coup framed as law would face no resistance. His insight into ways bureaucracy was prophetic. Once an empire becomes too dependent on form, its rulers can be replaced simply by mastering the form. He understood that power now lay in continuity. People would support the new order because they wanted the appearance of stability more than justice. That knowledge allowed him to act with absolute calm. From the outside, it looked like a daring gamble. From his perspective, it was administrative maintenance. Cao Shuang's fall marked more than the victory of one man over another. It symbolized the transformation of Chinese imperial politics. The age of the conquering founder was over. The age of the managing minister had begun. Sima Yi's success was possible only because Wei had become too tired to resist. The officials who should have debated principles instead filed reports. The generals who should have challenged illegality waited for orders. The bureaucracy functioned like an immune system that attacks disruption rather than disease. In this environment, the man who could manipulate procedure wielded greater power than the man who commanded armies. That was Sima Yi's real genius. He didn't fight the empire, he became its most efficient symptom. Cao Shuang left no legacy beyond a cautionary tale. His name became shorthand for naivete, a man who mistook title for power. Sima Yi's family, on the other hand, inherited the empire he, quote, restored. Within a generation, his grandson Sima Yan declared himself emperor of Jin, replacing Wei entirely. The dynasty founded by the Caos had been consumed by its own caretaker. But even Sima Yi's triumph carried irony. The same bureaucratic inertia that made his victory easy would later paralyze Jin itself. The system he mastered would one day devour his descendants, as it had devoured Cao Shuang. The lesson endures. Once a state grows addicted to procedure, cunning replaces courage as the path to power. The coup at Gaoping was not a story of betrayal, it was a study in understanding. Sima Yi knew his empire better than anyone else. He understood its psychology, its paperwork, and its limits. He moved when he knew that resistance would look unreasonable and surrender would look prudent. Cao Shuang, in contrast, lived in the illusion that the empire still operated on loyalty, prestige, and ceremony. He never saw that the engine had changed, that by the time he sat on the throne's left hand, the machinery of the state no longer belonged to him. Sima Yi's certainty was born of long observation and a lifetime of patience. He bet on human predictability and won. In the end, it wasn't brilliance that made him victorious, it was fluency. Fluency in how institutions think, how power ossifies, and how pride blinds men who believe their position is proof of permanence. Cao Shuang lost because he thought power was visible.
Sima Yi won because he knew it had gone invisible.